In this video, I'm going to be explaining and showing you every single graphics option for the 3DS emulator, Lime3DS. With these graphics guides, I break all of these options down and give you side-by-side examples. So by the end of the video, you'll know what all of these options do, and more importantly, what they actually look like. Now, since the demise of Citra, there's been quite a number of different ports, including Lime3DS. And the nice thing with this guide is that it should apply to all of these different ports, including the original, because all of their graphics options are exactly the same between them. So obviously you want to start Lime3DS up, then go into the emulation options in the top left hand corner and click on configure. And you've got all of these different options on the left hand side, but of course we're going to be going for graphics. So at the top here, you've got three different tabs: Enhancements, Layout, and Advanced. And counterintuitively, we actually need to start with the Advanced tab, right at the top with the Graphics API settings / Graphics Backend. So you've actually got three different graphics backends to choose from. Software at the top is the most accurate, but it is the most performance costly. Because it's using software mode, you can't use any of the enhancements with it or increase the internal resolution. And it's using the CPU for all instructions, which is why it is very performance costly. And you should really only be using it if you don't have OpenGL or Vulkan available, or if you've got really good hardware and you're a purist. Now, between OpenGL and Vulkan, Vulkan is definitely the better one to use with this emulator. However, some older graphics cards and some mobile devices are just not going to have Vulkan available, in which case just go ahead and use OpenGL. But if you do have Vulkan, I've got good news. This significantly reduces the stutter that you can see when you're using OpenGL, as it also uses some shader generation options. So in a nutshell, use Vulkan if you got it and OpenGL if you don't. With the physical device, if you've got multiple options to choose from, definitely select the main GPU that you want to be using. So if you've got an APU and a GPU, it might come up with two different options, but select the main one that you want to be using. Now, the SPIRV shader generation option is exclusive to Vulkan and is pretty much what gives it the edge over OpenGL. So you definitely want to be leaving this on by default if you want that extra performance. Now, all of these options in the renderer section are also directly tied to your performance, and for the most part, these are set up exactly how you want them to be out the box. So enable hardware shader will use your graphics API with your graphics card for all of the shader stuff, which is of course the entire point of using a graphics card, so you definitely want to be leaving this on. Accurate multiplication is obviously an accuracy option, and a few games do require this on to render correctly, but it does eat up more performance. So if you've got a really good graphics card, you can leave this on, set it and forget it. However, if you are on a lower end graphics card and you're scrounging for extra performance, you can turn this off by default and then turn it on for those games that require it. Enable shader JIT you should really leave on by default for extra performance. You can turn it off if accuracy is your priority, but it's definitely going to tank your performance. And whether or not you're going to notice a difference with this on or off graphically, you're probably going to need these games side by side to be able to tell the difference. So for me, this goes on and it stays on. Now, enable async shader compilation really should be only used as a last ditch attempt to get extra performance. It will compile shaders in the background, but it will introduce temporary graphical glitches, which is why it should only be used as a last resort. Enable presentation will use separate threads to render everything, which is of course much better for your performance, especially if you're using Vulkan. Another one for me that goes on and stays on. So moving down to this advanced section with texture sampling. Now, the devs of the actual games would apply different texture sampling / filtering to different textures of the game to obviously make it look as good as it can on that small display. And if you want to follow along with exactly what they've set, use game controlled. However, we can force nearest neighbor filtering or linear filtering to every single texture in the game. Setting nearest neighbor will make things look a lot sharper, but it will have a lot of jagged edges. Whereas setting linear will smooth absolutely everything in the game. And this is most noticeable with the 2D assets. This is definitely a personal preference thing, and for me, game controlled is just fine. Now, use this shader cache reduces the shader compilation stutter, and you should definitely leave it on by default. There's no real reason to leave it off. And enable VSync, it's recommended to leave it on with this emulator to avoid screen tearing. Now that we're all done with the advanced tab, we can move over to enhancements. So with your internal resolution, obviously the higher you set this, the better your graphics are going to look. And it's generally recommended to set this as close to your screen resolution as possible. So if you're on a 1080p monitor, ×5 should do you just fine. However, because this emulator doesn't have any anti-aliasing options, You can set this above your screen resolution, which will increase your pixel count, further reducing the amount of those jaggies. And that technique is called super sample anti-aliasing. So you can go beyond your screen resolution, but obviously that does increase your performance cost. Now this linear filtering option can sometimes be confused with the linear texture sampling. These are only applied exclusively to the textures, whereas this linear filter sits on top of the entire image. And it makes a teeny tiny difference, but it's still a difference. Leave it on for a smoother overall image and turn it off for a sharper one. Although most of us, including me, tend to leave it on. Now with post-processing shaders, these are generally used for things like CRT effects. And with this emulator, it doesn't actually come with any. And to be honest, with 3DS games, you don't really need to use shaders for any reason. But that's just my opinion. But if you do want to use them, ultimately, you're going to have to add your own. Now texture filtering is generally used to give the illusion of sharper and higher detail on those low resolution textures. And this is definitely another personal preference thing. You can choose between all of these different algorithms to change how those textures look. For me personally, I don't generally tend to use this because you'd be hard pressed to actually see their effects at higher resolutions. Now stereoscopy really only comes in handy if you have a way to display these games in 3D, which most of us do not, including myself, so we're just going to quickly skim past it and move down to utility. Now all of these options are for HD texture packs, and if you want to use those, of course you need to activate Use Custom Textures. You can preload them at the beginning of the game, which will of course increase your loading time, but it can also improve your performance. And you definitely want to leave Async Custom Texture Loading on by default if you're using those. Now that we're done with enhancements, we can move on to layout, which is of course one of the most important parts of 3DS emulation. How you set these two screens up really comes down to your personal preference. For me, I'll do this on a game-by-game basis, depending on which screen is more important. So for example, if I'm playing a game where both screens are equally important, I will leave this on default. But for other games where the touchscreen is really only meant for menuing, I'll have this on large screen. And there's also some games out there where the touchscreen isn't useful at all, in which case I'll use single screen. And that's because I want the screen that is taking precedence to be as big as it can be. If you've got a dual monitor setup, I fully recommend using separate windows and displaying them on each of your displays. In my opinion, that's the best way to use this emulator. But for me, I tend to leave this on large screen by default and then change it on a per game basis. Now you might find yourself in the situation where you want the touch screen to be the large screen, in which case just activate Swap Screens. And Rotate Screens Upright is of course for those games that display in the vertical orientation. Now you can set a custom layout if you wanted to, so you can position those screens in any position you want and at any size you want, but it is a lot of faff. And the only thing I find myself fine tuning is the large screen proportion. So when I set this to large screen, I then get access to this option, which means that I can increase or decrease the size of it depending on how big I want that touchscreen to be. Now when it comes to layout, that's pretty much all the advice that I can give you, because this is so dependent on personal preference or what is required by the game. So definitely have a play around with this one to figure out what you like and what you don't like. Now the nice thing with this emulator is that you can save all of these settings on a per game basis, allowing you to set it and then forget it. Adjusting these settings per game and seeing all of your changes take place in real time is actually really easy. So all you got to do is start up your game and then press F11 to go to windowed mode. Then go into the emulation options and go to configure current game. This will bring up a bunch of different options, including all of those graphics options that we've just covered. And the nice thing is, whatever we change these to, as long as we hit apply, it will be updated in real time. So I fully recommend just have at it and change whatever you want to see what you like and what you don't like. There we go, that was my full graphical options breakdown guide thingy for Lime3DS. Now I've already done this for a bunch of other emulators, including DuckStation and PCSX2, and I'll put links for all of those videos in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, slam me a thumbs up, and if you want to keep up to date with all of this, you know what to do. And apart from that, go play some games. Adios.